History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Preface. Turmoil everywhere, so it's back to the drawing board. So ran the title given by the editor of the Times in 1989 to a light-hearted article setting out the case for revising this history and preparing a new edition of it. 18 months or so later, the last day of 1991 hardly seemed to be one on which to labor the point that historical perspectives can quickly change, though that they do was the best reason for a new edition. Yet I found that revision still left much of the book unchanged. Perhaps this is unsurprising, though there had been new material to include. Neither my general approach nor my judgments about the proportions of my story had altered, nor had the standpoint from which I wrote it. Most of my original preface could stand, therefore, with only minor alterations in much the same words as in earlier revisions. It may, though, be worth repeating that world history is inseparably part of the way we see things. Even if the limits of our own historical horizon are not very far away, we strive to make sense of events by getting them in perspective and, in fact, make judgments about world history all the time. Our minds are not going to be kept empty of them, and those who do not have decent history in their heads will have bad. Most men and women have some notions, however inadequate, about how the world came to be, what it is, and such ideas are less dangerous if they are made explicit. Perhaps professional historians are now readier to accept that than even a few years ago. Readers of the first edition of this book will know that one way in which I have tried to increase our awareness of such judgments and make them a little easier to criticize is by recalling the sheer weight of inherited past. Historical inertia is easily underrated. This is not just a matter of what we can see. Ruins and beefeaters are picturesque, but for the most part, less important than much mental and institutional history lost to sight in the welter of the day to day events. It is already beginning to require an effort to remember that what was called the Cold War dominated much of the 1950s and 1960s. Recent as that is, the historical forces molding the outlook of Americans, Russians, and Chinese for centuries before the word capitalism and communism were invented are easier to still overlook. Distant history still clutters up our lives and thinking. Even our choices of the dates around which we construct our accounts of the past are shaped by history. Calendars are cultural artifacts, after all. From the start, I have tried in this book to balance the attention given to the effects of historical inertia by another great fact: mankind's unique power to produce change. Many people find this easier to recognize than the way past history inhibits human freedom. Evidence of the acceleration of change, its growth in scale, and its wider and wider geographical spread has continued to accumulate in recent years, and much of it shows a continuing increase in the conscious power to master the world of nature. Lately, though, this mastery has been clouded. The enthusiasm once felt for technical and intellectual achievement has given way to disfavor. The Great Depression, Auschwitz, and Hiroshima were followed by pollution, fear of overpopulation, and the threat of war with ever more frightful weapons, to name only a handful of 20th century evils. Many people now seem to distrust those Promethean visions of man which were in the past so easily distorted into an optimism which assumed that inevitable success lay ahead. Personally, I doubt whether any balanced judgment about the significance of much that has recently happened is ever struck solely on the basis of a knowledge of historical facts. Optimism and pessimism still seem to me to be, for the most part, a matter of temperament. And even if my impression is wrong, it does not seem to me that many safe predictions can follow from such facts as history provides. How many of us could rightly have judged the future of the USSR when the first edition of this book appeared? We can only make judgments, not necessarily inductions. They do not force us to conclude either that we are now facing problems specially recalcitrant, or on the other hand, that we are not. Just as when I wrote my first preface to this book, the odds still seem to me to be that the world organized as we know it certainly cannot last much longer, but that ordered and civilized life will go on in most places where it already exists. We have no reason to suppose that the outcome will be any more intolerable than, say, the results of changes forced on traditional Asia and Africa within the last century by the coming of Western technology, and many people may reasonably argue that this would be intolerable enough. Nevertheless, my main ideas have not changed. The words with which I ended this book 17 years ago seem as apposite as ever, and I have no difficulty in deciding that they should still find a place in this new edition. For those readers who have never looked into world history before, it may be worth adding that I have sought in these pages to tell a unified story and not to bring together a new collection of accounts traditionally important themes. Beyond this, the book was shaped also by a wish to avoid detail and to set out instead major historical processes, their comparative scale, and relations with one another. I have not tried to write continuous histories of all major countries or fields of human activity. The place for a comprehensive account of the facts about the past is an encyclopedia. I have assumed that my readers can get at one and at dictionaries and atlases. Consequently, some topics of great scholarly interests and some of which we are much aware because of the glamour of what they have left behind are passed over briefly or even ignored in that what follows, though we still gape in amazement at the ruins of Yucatan and Zimbabwe and wonder over the statues of Easter Island, and intrinsically desirable though knowledge of the societies which produced these things may be, they are peripheral to world history. The early centuries of Black Africa or the story of pre Columbian America are for the same reason only lightly sketched in these pages. What Europeans later brought back from and did to those continents is a different matter. It has shaped and continues to shape our lives, even if only in a small degree. But nothing in the history of Black Africa or the Americas between very remote times and the coming of the Europeans to those continents affected the great world forming culture traditions in which the legacies of, say, the Buddha, the Hebrew prophets, Plato, and Confucius were for centuries, as they still are today, living and shaping influences on millions of people. Even in writing a selective account, it is easy to feel swamped by the huge quantities of printed evidence and massed scholarly monographs which now fill historical libraries. Fortunately, there is not the slightest chance of mastering all that might be read that is relevant to the world history, and I have an easy conscience. But bibliography can skew judgment. There is always a temptation to write about something which has given rise to much academic debate. What matters, though, is that a topic is important, not that we may be lucky enough to have information about it. Napoleon, however, crucial for France and even Europe, seemed to me safer to pass over briefly, say the Chinese Revolution. In the most recent period of history, it is more important than ever to distinguish the wood from the trees and not to mention something simply because it turns up every day in the newspaper or on television. That medium, nonetheless, has influenced me in one respect since my first edition. An opportunity to make a series of films for the BBC under the title of The Triumph of the West and the writing of a book about it both forced me to think again about the role of Europe and its civilization in the world history. The more I studied it, the less I felt misgivings about the recognition I had given to that civilization in this account. The more I thought about it, the more the centrality of Europe's role in the making of the modern world stood out. Of course, I have striven not to be trapped by a Eurocentric viewpoint, and if I have confirmed, I have not increased the weight I gave to that theme when writing my first drafts 20 or so years ago. The impulses of my own historical inheritance were bound to influence my choice of themes, organization, and chronological arrangement, of course, and I still cannot believe, to quote Lord Acton's ideal of historical objectivity, that nothing shall reveal the country, the religion, or the party to which I belong, nor that I could provide, as he hoped, an account of Waterloo to satisfy the French, English, German, and Dutch alike. Not that I had time and space here to spend on such a theme. I hope, nevertheless, that an effort to remain aware of my assumptions and their limitations may have made it possible to provide what he termed a history which is distinct from the combined history of all countries, and which nevertheless displays a variety of the great cultural traditions which give it much more of its structure. The reader should blame no one but the author for what seems inadequate or erroneous, nor, indeed, for anything else in this book. Yet many other people helped me to bring it into being. In its latest form, it has been specially shaped by the tireless scrutiny of my editors, Adam Sisman and Anna Lucia Norton, to whom I owe much, and in another important sense, it has been made possible only by the efforts of a team of ladies who have typed and retyped my drafts. Mrs. Moira Weiss, Miss Clara Bass, Mrs. John Barton, and Mrs. Leslie Walsh. To all of them, I am most grateful. I wish also to thank Mr. Eric Smith, especially for his close eye on unflagging attention to the maps. There were many others to whose informed influence and suggestions I owed much over many years. I explained in my first preface that they were too numerous to be acknowledged individually, though I was happy to record that the debt I owed to them and now gladly to do so again. To that, I must add further thanks owed to the many correspondents who have written to me in the last decade and a half, offering specific criticism, suggestion, denunciations, and encouragement, too numerous though they, too, are for me to name here. If I do not seem always to have taken much notice of what they had said, I can assure them are mistaken in that impression. Those whose help is more easily identifiable because I deliberately consulted them and to whom I continue to feel special gratitude were listed in the old preface. that recorded stands and there is no need to repeat it here. More names must now, nevertheless, be added to theirs, and I wish to record my warmest thanks to Sir Brian Cartledge, Dr. C. A. Grocock, and Mr. R. Inskeep, to Professors Vessos Karagiologis, H. W. Ardent, and Elizabeth Verba, and to Mr. M. M. Roberts, all of whom gave me valuable observations and suggestions. I must acknowledge too how stimulating I found the books of Professor E. L. Jones in preparing this new edition. None of these, of course, bears any responsibility for the final outcome that rests entirely with me. As for my debt to my wife, I should not wish to alter what I have already written about that in any respect to save one by correcting a misprint which slid into the last preface to this book. In an indispensable sense, this book is hers. JMR 1994. Note: where they are known, dates of birth and death, and in case of rulers, regional dates for all the persons mentioned by name in the text are given in the index.